Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Jewish Bazaar. Jessica can't join us today. She was unable to make, unable to make bail, but she's going to try and make it to the next one. But don't fret. I'm here with Eddy Portnoy.
You know, I heard that Jessica's actually got a job as a colostomy bag fitter.
She did. She was laid off during COVID,
Okay, I'm glad
which
she's
all
back.
she's back where she's in county lockup right now. So we'll explore that in a future issue of the Jewish Bazaar. But today we have Dr. Eddy Portnoy, Jewish historian, and the director of Fascination at the Evo Institute for Jewish Research. And I am Dr. Tony Michels, professor of American Jewish History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we're here today to discuss Jews and riots. We don't hear much about Jews and riots anymore. Jews don't seem to riot anymore, at least not in this country, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
You know,
So
you sometimes hear that Jews are a riot.
Jews are a riot. There were many bands. There's Jewish Riot, which was a band from Russia that made the news a few years ago.
Yeah, I think you mean Jewish Pussy Riot.
I'm not sure about that. We might be getting our wires crossed. There's something like that came out of Russia a few years ago. So you're right. Maybe there is some contemporary tie-ins, but we're going to explore this today. Jews, riots, when Jews rioted, why don't Jews riot anymore? Maybe there is still Jewish rioting going on.
Yeah, I think there might be.
Well, let's get us, Eddy, start us off. Why are we even discussing riotous Jews?
It's a good question. I think mostly because we want to. But we're going to start off with a Jewish riot that took place on the Lower East Side in 1906. It's known as the Tonsil Riot, and maybe you imagine people reaching deep into people's throats, grabbing their tonsils and throwing them at others, but that's not really what this was. In late June of 1906, there was an outbreak of tonsillitis in many of the public schools on the Lower East Side, and the principals of these schools thought they had a good solution, because part of the reason they wanted a solution was that, one, this disease was spreading, and they wanted to stop it. So they thought, we should arrange for tonsillectomies for these poor Jewish immigrant students who probably don't get good medical care anyways. So they'll probably be quite happy if we arrange for surgeries for them. So they, in one particular school, they arranged for about 80 students to get tonsillectomies in school. They actually brought doctors from Mount Sinai Hospital into the schools and gave about 80 students tonsillectomies. Now, how this transpired is a bit odd. They did send home permission slips, many of which were signed by Epstein's mother. I guess that fell flat. Sorry. But they did send home permission slips, and in some cases, it was thought that the parents, especially the mothers, many of whom were illiterate, couldn't read the permission slips, and the kids just sort of said, we were told you to have you sign this. So they did. In other cases, the kids just signed the permission slips themselves. So one day, I think it was June 27th, 1906, about 80 kids came home to their tenements drooling blood. And their parents said to them, what happened? And they said, oh, doctors came into the school and cut our throats. And so rumors started to spread throughout the tenements that, doctors were coming from uptown and cutting the throats of Jewish children in the public schools. The rumor spread all night. The next morning, a sort of mass of about 50,000 Jewish mothers besieged a dozen public schools on the Lower East Side, demanding to see their children. And they, grabbed fruit off push carts, started whipping it at the school windows. They brought ladders in so they could climb into second floor windows. This was like a full scale riot. They attacked people on the street, anybody who vaguely resembled a doctor. And there was one case of a telephone repairman who was walking around with the pliers hanging from his belt, and he was accused of reaching into children's throats with his pliers and yanking out their tonsils. He was beaten mercilessly and had to be saved by police from two different precincts. And
Who did the beating? Who beat this
beating
poor
Jewish mothers.
lad? Jewish mothers. Okay.
This is a riot almost exclusively of Jewish mothers, on the Lower East Side, demanding to see their children. And in fact, in these 12 schools that they besieged, the schools had to be shut down, and they let all the kids go home because they couldn't continue on their day. And it was really kind of a strange episode in the history of this neighborhood. You don't normally hear of significant numbers, in the tens of thousands of Jewish mothers, attacking public schools.
Wait, I got to interrupt here because
I think that if
yeah,
you raise your finger in a
yeah,
podcast,
yeah.
no one's going to know you're doing that.
No, well,
But I know you're doing
you
that. I know
noticed.
you're
You
doing
just
that. Yeah.
noticed it, and that's what counts. One thing is surprising is that Jewish mothers are known to revere doctors, right?
Yeah.
Why would they riot against doctors? Why didn't they rally in the streets to praise doctors? Why didn't they go out into the streets to say, "I want my son to be a doctor"? Or my
Right.
daughter to be a doctor, but instead they beat the doctors or
Right.
wanted
Well,
to beat the doctor.
they didn't actually find any doctors to beat, but they did want. And it's not clear that they would have necessarily they would have beaten the doctors had they actually found them. But this idea that uptown doctors with whom they had no familiarity were coming downtown, and slitting their children's throats, was a frightening prospect. Now, the part of the backstory of this is that beginning in May 1906, the month previous, there was a huge rash of pogroms in and around Bialystok in northeastern Poland, and hundreds of Jews had been killed, and thousands had been wounded. And the Yiddish newspapers were full of articles with gruesome descriptions of what had happened to Jewish victims during these pogroms. And one interesting aspect of this is there were the Vorwärts, which is the largest Yiddish newspaper on the Lower East Side, happened to change printers at the time and started to include more photographs. And they happened to begin including photographs of the dead and wounded. And this is something that a Jewish audience hadn't really seen before. And so this episode, when Jewish kids came home from school drooling blood and told parents that their doctors had come and cut their throats, it was perceived as a pogrom, by this immigrant community. They thought that a pogrom was happening on the Lower East Side, perpetrated by uptown doctors, but a pogrom nonetheless. And so they reacted in a way, a kind of crazed way, in order to protect their children.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, why would they be suspicious of uptown doctors? I mean, I understand that they don't know who they are, but why suspect them of something violent?
Well, it's interesting. It's less the doctors and more the principals of the schools.
Hmm.
Complaints written about in the Yiddish press had less to do with the actual doctors who came and did the procedures than with what they called, in fact, the Wahrheit, which is another socialist Zionist newspaper on the Lower East Side. They claimed that the Irish principals had no respect for Jewish immigrant parents.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the real perpetrators behind this episode. And in fact, they were the ones who invited these doctors down to do this. It was their idea in the first place that, we should just give these kids tonsillectomies, they don't get good medical care anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they sent permission slips home that used, kind of medical slash technical language that these people clearly didn't understand, even if it was read to them. And so, like I said, some permission slips got signed, others didn't. But had the permission slips been in Yiddish, they would have understood what was going on, and they more than likely would have said, absolutely not. Who gives, who performs surgery in a public school? That's insane.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think also Jews had some suspicion of the public school system. On the one hand, they sent their kids to public schools probably in higher numbers than most other immigrants, and at the same time, public schools were there was a fair amount of anti-Semitism or xenophobia more broadly in the public schools. Children were punished for speaking Yiddish. They were. Uh,
Oh yeah, they,
uh,
they had their names changed in public schools.
mhm.
That was very common. Teachers said, you can't have these foreign sounding names. You've got to change them. I mean, there's a great
Yeah,
misconception that names got changed on Ellis Island. They didn't.
they often got
Um,
changed in schools.
yeah, in schools or in workplaces or elsewhere. Um, so yeah, there. The idea of you know looking, speaking, acting different was
Hmm.
very much frowned upon, and so there was this is all part of a huge drive to Americanize all kinds of different immigrants, and since you had such huge numbers of Jews on the Lower East Side, they were the main victims of this kind of thing.
There's a writer named Morris Shappies, who you know of. Guy came out of the communist movement. He grew up on the Lower East Side and developed a stutter because he was disciplined for using Yiddish. Uh, even not necessarily even speaking it fluently, just using some Yiddish words, and he became so self conscious as a kid, and so afraid of his teachers that he developed a stutter for many years. I don't think that was entirely unusual. People were really ashamed
Right? No, I
of
don't. I
of
don't think so at all. That it was unusual. I mean, and also you have to keep in mind that during this time, corporal punishment was permitted in schools.
yeah.
Teachers could beat students with rulers or things like that, and for a small immigrant child, that's for any child, it's really a frightening kind of episode.
And did the newspapers try to calm the Jewish masses down, or did they stoke their fears?
They mostly tried to calm them down. Uh, the the only Yiddish paper that uh, took a negative view of the mothers who riot. Most of the newspapers understood why this happened.
Hmm.
They were clear in saying that you know these mothers, to a certain degree, were even though it was a type of hysteria as they saw it. They were right to try to find out what was going on in the schools and what was happening with their children. But for instance, the Morgen Journal, which is a more conservative Orthodox paper, they had a big banner headline that said, uh, you know, Narasha Mutters, stupid mothers, um, you know, rioting over nothing, causing problems over nothing. But one interesting thing is that in the days after this riot happened, another similar riot took place in Brownsville, which is also a heavily Jewish neighborhood. Sort of
In
a sort of
Brooklyn.
a sort of copycat riot, even though no tonsillectomies took place there.
Hmm.
Um, people became very excitable, and on the same day, a similar riot took place in Little Italy with Italian mothers. So it wasn't just the Jews, um, but when the Italian mothers rioted in Little Italy, or when they at least not when they masses of them approached the schools, the teachers brought the children to the windows of the classrooms and shouted out, your children are fine. This is not nothing is happening here. And they went home. The whole thing was sort of called off. Um, but it was this interesting episode of rumors getting spread, and fear becoming instilled in certain communities and immigrant communities, and how these people reacted. It's really it's pretty fascinating. to see the similar reactions on the part of Jewish mothers and Italian mothers. Um, there was one in one of the English language newspapers. I think it was the New York Tribune. They interviewed this. I don't know. She'd be like a 12-year-old Italian girl who had told her teacher uh, that morning that she should watch out because her father, and the newspaper quotes her in dialect, her father might to bring a the knife. So it was it was something that they needed to be concerned about, but it was apparently it was easy to show that the kids were okay, and that this that it was a really kind of a pretty major overreaction.
The Tonsil Riot in 1906 wasn't, I mean, by that time it was, rioting wasn't unknown
Oh
among
no.
Jews or others in the city. There were already, it was already a feature of life. Violence was a common feature of Jewish life back then. I mean, one of the famous riots, more famous actually, I think, than the Tonsil Riot, was the 1902 Kosher Meat Boycott,
Oh yeah, that's
uh,
that's that's probably the most famous of all Jewish riots.
which didn't start as a riot, but it didn't start as a riot. It started as a boycott of kosher butchers in the and the kosher meat industry because price of kosher meat had gone up uh, very high, and women, uh, ordinary housewives were finding it more difficult than usual to feed their children, to feed their families, and so a boycott ensued. First, I think in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and then it spread to a number of cities, all the way up to Boston, Newark, I think Philadelphia. So this boycott turned into a kind of mass movement initiated by by Jewish women who did not think of themselves as radical activists. They were just trying to make ends meet and feed their families and maintain a home. But things really became confrontational pretty quickly, and there were press reports of women smashing windows, of attacking policemen. I've read about women hitting policemen, flogging policemen with raw meat that was taken out of the butcher, that was stolen from the butchers. When the windows were smashed and people would. So
Yeah, I've
yeah,
also heard that they stole like piles of raw meat from the butcher shops and threw it in the street and set it on fire.
no, yeah, I think I came
Um,
across that as well.
yeah, that's
So the
it was a
boycott turned violent and turned into a riot. That was several years earlier, but that wasn't the only. I mean, these aren't the only ones. I mean, there were rent strikes that sometimes turned violent. There was labor strikes often turned violent and sometimes into kinds of riots, mini riots,
right.
not
One thing I
necessarily
would
huge ones.
one thing I think we should point out is
Yeah,
that or at least one of the interesting aspects of this is many of these riots were women led
yeah,
events. Obviously the tonsil riot is
hmm
the kosher meat boycott
boycott.
and
Yeah,
strike and riot. Those were women led as well, and also many of the rent strikes
hmm
were led by women. And there are a number of newspaper articles from the period from
hmm
I would say 1907 to 1910 where you have sort of a rash of
hmm
rent strikes, and you have them all during this period during the early 20th century, where you find reports of women attacking landlords and their agents, physically attacking them, and it becomes a fairly regular phenomenon.
hmm hmm
And it's this very sort of interesting turn uh, of in the roles of women
yeah,
for Jewish immigrants. You don't hear about many activities like this in the old country in Eastern
hmm
Europe. But when Jews immigrate to the United States, this women take on a kind of new role,
well,
and Go
I,
ahead.
I would just say it's part of it is a new they take on new role, and we should talk about that. But another is that they're performing traditional roles that are so disrupted in the new country that they wind up protesting and confronting authority and sometimes riot. And that again is shown, I think, both by the Tonsil riot and the Kosher Meat Boycott riot. They're actually performing similar roles. They're raising their children. They're trying to feed a family, but it gets so difficult to do that in this era, the in the immigrant era, that that what would normally be an ordinary fact of life, buying food, preparing the food, serving it to your children, or looking after their health, become volatile because they can't afford to do. In the case of the kosher meat boycott, they're finding it impossible to feed their families. So they're playing the same role, but the same role
Right.
becomes politicized, or if that's the right word here, it
Right.
becomes subject to social protest, and
Right.
that's part of it. So the other part is like you're saying, they're new roles, and not only new roles, but new um, the old standards of behavior in the old country that would have prohibited that kind of behavior, protesting and rioting. That's breaking down or dissolving in the United States. So it's sort of anything goes in New York City.
Right. It's like it's an opportunity to take initiative, and they take
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah.
And so you wind up with with, and also, another aspect of this is, I didn't mention this, but during the tonsil riot,
Mm-hmm.
some of the rumors and the violence was fomented by street corner orators, many of whom were women.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was also something unusual, something that you don't hear much about, but sort of women jumping up on soapboxes and exhorting crowds, and
Mm-hmm.
getting them to do things. In fact, some of them during the tonsil riot were arrested
Mm-hmm.
for allegedly fomenting violence.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty unusual and interesting.
Yeah. I remember reading, I think one of the first examples I read about in the Yiddish press was a riot, an incident in, I think it was 1894, and I think it was a baker's strike. I'm not 100% sure now, but it was a strike in 1894 that turned violent in the streets. And there were press reports of teenage girls, Jewish girls, pulling out pulling out the hair of policemen. Oh no, I'm sorry. Some were attacking. I got that wrong. Some were
Well,
attacking
you know what? I
policemen.
wish you had gotten that right.
No, I'll tell you what I got right. They were pulling the beards of older Jewish men.
Oh.
That's what they were doing.
Oh,
They were like
these were the
yanking out the
bakers,
hair. This was during a baker strike, as I recall.
right? But
And
were these the actual bakers whose beards they were pulling out, or these are just
it's it,
random
it's
bearded
not
dudes?
it wasn't clear to me from the press report. I don't think it was the bakers. I think it would have been someone else, as I recall. But and and at one point during the strike, they went to the newspaper office, the editorial offices of the Yiddisches Tageblatt, the only Yiddish daily at the time, and smashed the windows because they thought the press coverage was too sympathetic to the bosses. And so they
Wow,
smashed
interesting.
they smashed the windows, and at one point went to the home of the publisher, and I don't think smashed his windows at home, but made it. I think they were scared to come out of their house.
Right, this was
So
Saracen.
this is Saracen, yeah, the publisher. So so by the early 20th century, there's already a pattern of another riot. Well, how could we forget the 1902? The same year that there was the kosher meat boycott in 1902, there was the 1902 Rabbi Joseph funeral
Oh
riot.
yeah, right.
Uh, this is actually kind of a sad story.
Oh,
Uh,
I think this is a great story.
well, what part of it do you think is great?
I mean, it's just dramatic.
It's dramatic. What's sad is poor Rabbi Joseph. So Jacob Joseph was a rabbi from Lithuania who was invited to come to the United States by Orthodox Jewish leaders in New York who wanted a chief rabbi. There was no chief rabbi in New York or anywhere in the
Right.
United States.
I guess we should point out that elsewhere, especially in Eastern Europe, there was always sort of a chief rabbi
Yeah.
of a town or a
Hmm.
city, or at least a council of them, and
Yes.
that was a common phenomenon in the United States that didn't exist at all.
No.
Everything was splintered.
Everything was splintered, and in the eyes of a lot of Orthodox Jews and their spokesmen, it was chaos in the Jewish community. There was no single authority. There was no cohesion. Like you said, it was fragment. Jewish communal life was fragmented and splintered. So they wanted a eminent rabbi to come to the United States, in part to preside over the regulation of the kosher meat industry. So here we are, back to the subject of kosher meat and how conflictual that was. But anyway, they brought over Rabbi Jacob Joseph. This is what now in the late 1880s, as I
Right.
recall. They brought him to the United States. He was going to be this eminent figure in Jewish communal life, not only to regulate the kosher meat industry, but generally to preside over religious life. And pretty quickly, he was ignored. I
Yeah,
mean,
he
even
was
his
roundly ignored.
he was roundly ignored, and he wound up really retreating from Jewish communal life. And I think he just sort of remained a Torah scholar, engaged in Torah study for many years until his death in 1902. So he died in near obscurity. Although maybe that's not, he
Well,
died in near
yeah,
obscurity, but then there was this huge funeral to honor the man who people showed almost no respect to from the moment he got to the United
right.
States.
And I think it's worth it to point out that funerals in Jewish life have traditionally been big affairs.
Mm,
It was always something of value to attend a funeral of a well known person.
mm, mhm,
To sort of pay your respects. And it was considered a communal event,
mhm,
and people always went to funerals of people they didn't know,
mhm,
in particular if they were famous.
mhm.
And so because Jacob Joseph was famous, um, and it was reported on in the newspapers when his death was reported upon in the newspapers, people sort of flocked to attend his funeral, and as a result, it was quite a large event.
A large, not the largest as we'd see later.
Oh no,
Sholem Aleichem's
right.
funeral procession, what, extended from the Bronx to Brooklyn or something like that?
Well, it went from the Bronx to Brooklyn, but it's something like 100,000 people participated in that funeral, which is allegedly the largest funeral that ever occurred in New York City.
Do you think it's plausible, that estimate? That estimate?
It could be. I don't know. It could also be entirely made up. But it was. I've seen. There are photographs of it, and it's enormous.
Yeah,
There are
it wasn't
many.
entirely made up. It might be exaggerated, but it was a
No, no.
huge. It was a huge funeral procession. Anyway,
It
but
could. There's a cadre of people who claim that the statistics of the Sholem Aleichem funeral are undercounted,
undercounted.
and they're actually more than 100,000.
Who are those people?
Small. I can't tell you who they
You
are.
can't tell.
Yeah.
We have to protect the sources. But the thing is with Joseph, and I don't know if this is unique. I don't think this happened um, during Sholem Aleichem's procession, but a riot broke out at Rabbi Joseph's funeral. Um,
Right, but
the,
why did this riot break out?
because I believe some workers, perhaps construction workers, started attacking the Jews.
Actually, they were workers from the Hoe printing factory.
The printing factory.
I HOE,
Aha.
not a place where hose are produced,
No, that's something else.
but it's the Hoe. I believe it's the Hoe printing factory,
Hmm.
and Irish workers, saw this, the sort of huge parade of Jews moving underneath their factory, and they came to the windows and began throwing things at the mourners. And the mourners responded by throwing things back at them. And so it became this kind of war between the Irish workers of the Hoe printing plant and the Jewish mourners of this funeral. And at some point, the police intervened, and when the police first arrived, they saw this these thousands of Jews throwing things at the Hoe printing factory. They began to beat up the Jews, and so
The Jews didn't like that.
the Jews were very unhappy with being beaten by the police. Although that was not an uncommon event on the Lower East Side at the time. The police frequently beat up the Jews for a variety of reasons. But in this case, they were seen throwing things at a factory, and the first reaction was, "Hey, this has to stop."
Hmm.
And then at some point, it was realized that the Jews had been attacked first, but it was the biggest problem was that this occurred during this somber funeral,
Yeah.
and it sort of destroyed the entire feeling of what was supposed
Rabbi
to be
Joseph
happening.
couldn't even die in peace.
Couldn't
It,
die in peace.
uh,
He pretty much lived in peace. He didn't do much.
he lived in peace, but with a certain degree of humiliation, in as much as he was supposed to be an esteemed figure,
Right.
and then was, as you say, roundly ignored. And then he passes away, in, of course, in poverty, in a New York tenement. And then a large crowd of people turn out to honor him, and then even that doesn't work out.
It's a sad situation, but
It was a sad situation, but there's a pattern. I mean, we all these events happen where we're happening, not every day, but with some frequency in the time period of roughly the 1880s to what 1920s.
yeah, that sounds about right. That sounds about right. And just out of curiosity, how do you think that these sort of mass violent activities on the part of the Jewish community, or portions of them at least, played into things, activities in, let's say, the labor movement, like the uprising of the 20,000.
Mm.
Did these events give them some sort of courage to continue engaging in protest? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think by the Tonsil riot, Jews had been going on labor strikes since the mid 1880s. Strikes were pretty frequent. You'd have these cycles of class conflict in Jewish community, not just in New York, but Philadelphia, Chicago, some of the other major centers, where you could have months of labor conflict. That happened in 1886. It happened again in 1890. It happened again in 1894. And on from there. I mean, there were strikes between 1909 and 1914, and there were almost 5 years of strikes among Jewish workers, most of whom worked in the clothing industry.
Right.
So,
So
this became going, protesting, asserting yourself in that way was totally by the 1890s. It was already a common thing, and those are often violent. They were
right.
violent typically because the bosses hired gangsters, prostitutes, and others to beat up the strikers. So strikes got pretty violent pretty quickly, and people and the workers fought back.
Right. So it seems that that it was actually the labor strikes that helped encourage Jews to engage in strikes of other sorts,
I
like
think
kosher
so.
meat strike or rent strikes, or or,
Absolutely.
or even a tonsil riot.
Because they created, I think, the connection. uh, there's a couple ways they encouraged it. I mean, one was, as you said, it raised their confidence and gave them the confidence to protest, to assert themselves pretty aggressively. uh, you could also see the influence of the labor strikes on the language of some of these rioters. So at the kosher meat boycott, they called themselves, they said they're going, oh, the very word boycott came to them from the labor movement. And the people who didn't honor the boycott, the housewives that didn't honor the boycott, were called scabs, which is a term from the labor movement.
Right.
So they were using, and socialists, by the way, came in and eventually took over the leadership of the kosher meat boycott. Whether that was good or bad is another question. But socialists were very much a part of all these activities. They often led them. So I think all this was going on. So there was a breakdown of traditional norms. It wasn't considered good behavior in traditional Jewish society to do any of this. It wasn't shame, certainly not for girls or women. And in America, girls. So there are two things that are changing, and you referred to these changing roles. One is that young people became more assertive. One is that housewives who became very assertive and aggressive even, and then women were doing this, not just men. So there was a change in generational behavior and gender behavior that was
Right.
fought, that emerged out of this context of conflict.
Right. And I think the generational behavior changes can be attributed to the aspect of immigration, wherein a child who's either brought over at a very young age and is
Yeah.
educated in a public school, or who is born here and then educated
Mm-hmm.
in public school, is much more confident
Yeah.
in American culture
Yeah.
than the immigrant parent
Hmm.
who doesn't speak the language very well, if at all,
Hmm.
and you know often has a type of work that's difficult, oppressive,
Hmm.
and underpaid. So I think that generational aspect makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess to a certain degree, women were freed from their traditional
Yeah.
roles. One of the things you mentioned about uh, Jacob Josephs, or is it Joseph Jacobs? Jacob Josephs. Um, he's
Jacob Joseph.
two first names. I don't know. That's a
Yeah.
tough
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. I think that was
So
one reason why his career failed.
right, I think that's obviously correct.
Yeah.
But what the role that he was brought over for, he eventually failed because there was this new phenomenon in America where rabbis weren't respected in the same way
No.
as they were in the old country.
Hmm.
And so that's one of the reasons why he wasn't particularly successful in this role.
Right.
And so you have through the sort of upheaval of immigration, you have all of these changes in either gender roles or
Hmm.
occupational roles or even in generational roles. It's
Or how you express your discontent. You know,
right,
going back to the very beginning. It becomes fairly common to express your discontent by rioting.
right.
Uh,
And I think that if you'd had riots you know in the Russian Empire, there's a strong chance that rioters would be killed.
right.
And I think that in America, there was a strong chance they might be beaten,
Hmm.
but
And often
being
we're
killed,
beaten.
yeah,
Yeah.
but being killed might
Right.
not happen. So that
Hmm.
they I think they understood that they were a bit freer to engage in these sorts of activities
Yeah,
than they were
that's actually
elsewhere.
crucial. There was freedom of speech in the United States, even though it was violated often in various ways. There was still greater freedom to express yourself, to protest, to rally, all these things. And again, it was violated all the time. Strikers were thrown in jail regularly, all that stuff. But there was much greater freedom, and you could reasonably expect not to be mowed down by
Right,
by by the police
right. Whereas
or other
in the
authorities.
Russian Empire, it was clearly different.
Clearly different.
Um, do you want to talk a bit about the 1908 Amigos riot?
Should we explain to the audience who the Amigos were?
I think you might have to.
Will the producer has to be prepared to edit this out entirely? Uh, no, you do. The Amigos were the venereal crabs that had infested my friend's apartment when I was younger, and all the guys living there, my friends, both had crabs, and they started calling them the Amigos. And what they do is they'd sprinkle them on the bed, inside the bed of each other. So they'd have the Amigos, and then they'd pluck them off and put them in the other guy's bed. And I used to visit them. Fortunately, I never caught the Amigos, but the Amigos were I mean, the Amigos were like the Tonsil riot in as much as they didn't just end with one incident. The Amigos were omnipresent for
Right.
a whole period of time
It's the
in
Amigo
our late
riot.
teens. It was the Amigo riot. Um, but I don't think the Amigos were Jewish. I mean, I think the Amigos were either Italian or from Puerto Rico.
Well, look, I mean, during the tonsil riot, you had Italians engaging in the same thing.
Uh,
So, these things, span different communities.
yeah, and they also have contributed to a fair amount of generational trauma.
Oh,
Uh,
undoubtedly.
there's no doubt about that. But going back to the riots of yore, so one thing we're talking about is how they're part of an historical period. of immigration, where millions of immigrants came to the United States. They were poor, they were working class, they lived in really miserable conditions in tenement apartments. They struggled to make ends meet. They struggled to earn a living in miserable working conditions. They were mistreated, and so they protested. And this went on for a long period of time. Eventually, riots disappeared. This kind of these street confrontations in what were called Jewish ghettos, Brownsville, the Lower East Side, and West Side of Chicago, other places. The Jewish ghettos eventually seemed to calm down. What happened to the rioting Jew?
I mean, I think too, what happened is you had, beginning in the mid 1920s, immigration was cut off. So the influx of immigrants was reduced significantly. You also had an outflow of Jews from these traditionally immigrant neighborhoods to newer neighborhoods, either in different parts of the city. In New York, you frequently had people moving to Brooklyn or to Harlem, and then later the Bronx, later New Jersey, and then subsequent to
The
that
suburbs.
the suburbs.
Yeah.
And so the Jews were dispersed, and I think in order for something like a riot to occur, you have to have a critical mass of humanity packed into a certain area. Uh, Otherwise, you know, when if you think about how other riots, you need a lot of people, and without with this sort of dispersal, uh, the community, and in addition to that, the immigrant generations and subsequent generations began to do better economically, and once you're more comfortable, and once you're more part of the general culture and community, there are different venues you can use to vent your anger.
Well, I think also another factor, in addition to those, is that by the 1920s, most Jewish workers are unionized, and
Yeah,
so there was an
that's
organized,
also a
yeah,
factor. Yeah,
there was an organized structure for them to engage in protests. There was organization, there was a leadership. Eventually, unions were recognized as legitimate by law, and so I think that's another factor. I mean, these early years, there were immigrants coming into the country all the time, as you say, packed into the Jewish ghettos. And they often weren't organized. They tried to organize over and over and over again, but they weren't really organized till some years later. So I think that's part of it. You have these spontaneous outbursts
right,
of
right,
anxiety and outrage, fueled, as you said, by rumor often. Just
right.
what.
Yeah, and I guess and
Yeah,
and I guess the structure of the union, sort of is able to control that. In
yeah,
addition, if the workers riot, the union's at fault and looks bad, so they certainly want to keep a lid on any kind of outbursts.
yeah.
They'll,
Especially if
they'll
they have to honor contracts as well.
right, of course,
Yeah,
like they have to, and they have, when a strike takes place, they have to manage the
have
strike.
to mention.
They
Yeah.
can't let it get out of hand.
Hmm. Hmm. But but riots, well, riots of course don't disappear from American life.
No, of course not.
They were very much
It's
part of the
just
1960s, for instance.
right.
Mm. But Jews weren't the
Other.
ones rioting.
I mean, it's also right. True. I mean, it's also been part of what's happened recently.
Right, that's right. Well, I think actually not only was there the this phenomenon of Jews rioting, not only that subside. I think there was an image that somehow took shape, or myth that took shape in the probably this, my guess would be the 60s, maybe 60s and 70s, that Jews never did riot, that they didn't engage in that kind of behavior. Jews were law abiding, according to the myth. Jews were law abiding. They worked hard and got ahead, and that's the way you do it. I think this history was forgotten, and maybe intentionally so.
Sure, of
But in
course.
any
I mean,
case,
all
for
all of
yeah,
all of this stuff we talk about has sort of been muzzled because it doesn't fit into the way that the Jews want to perceive themselves.
certainly, yeah. So at least after World War II.
Right.
when there was a certain cleansing of, of Jewish history from all the strange and bizarre things we're talking about. But wait a minute, what about Orthodox Jews? Maybe not in this country. Is there in the recent years, have there been
Oh
any
yeah. I
in
mean,
Israel certainly?
sure, of course, they riot not infrequently. Um, that's I mean, it's obviously a different, you know, time and place, but yes, you have the same sort of critical mass of humanity that you need for a riot. And if they feel that I think I'm just trying to think of a particular episode. There was one where they were going to put a parking garage, or they were building a parking garage in Jerusalem, and it was near a religious neighborhood, and it was going to be open, 24/7. Uh, for Orthodox Jews, everything's got to be 24/6. And so the fact that, this was going to be open all the time was a problem for them. And they began protests, and those protests devolved into violence. And one of the interesting thing that's I think distinct to, these Haredi riots
Ultra
in Israel
Orthodox.
is that one of the weapons of choice uh, is full diapers. The
Full
police always
diapers.
complain of having
Are you talking about
getting pelted.
full size? Are you talking about full size
No,
diapers?
no, I'm talking about diapers full of poo,
Oh, oh,
um,
oh.
that get chucked because these are communities that have pretty large numbers of children, and so poo-filled diapers are a byproduct of this life that doesn't really have much use, except for in a riot. So it's just one distinct aspect to this particular Jewish riot.
Have you ever been in a riot, Eddie?
Um, I don't think so. Not that I recall. What about you? Other than the Amigo riot?
I have not been in a riot. I wouldn't be a good rider. I wear glasses.
Yeah, yeah, me too.
Uh,
Obviously, me too. It's a
y-
problem. It's a problem for rioters.
yeah,
If you wear glasses, you could be in trouble.
yeah,
Um, it's a problematic aspect.
yeah. And my insurance coverage doesn't actually. My policy
Doesn't cover
doesn't cover.
riots.
It doesn't cover riots. So if my glasses break, then I'm out of pocket.
Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah, you should stay away from riots if you're able.
So let's end on that note. If you're able, everyone, stay away from riots. Unless you're studying Jewish history, then jump in. Well, that was fascinating, Eddie, and thanks to everybody for joining us in this latest installment of the Jewish Bazaar. Tony Michels,
And I'm who am I? Eddy Portnoy.
Josh Portnoy, and thank you for listening. We'll be back next week.